right, so we're going to just start off because we had a lot of rain recently that followed up after very dry conditions that we've experienced in the Miami Valley. So my first question is, how is drought monitored?
Wow, that's a very good question. So drought, as you know, is more than just, say, precipitation deficits. We obviously, it's a key component of this is how much rainfall, how much rain has fallen over a given period of time, and how that compares to our historical average. But we also look at a lot of things as well, other things like soil moisture. How is, are our soils drying out rapidly or over a long period of time? We take a look at stream flows as well. So when we say the word monitor, we're monitoring a lot of things, not just the precip, but how our soils are changing, our stream flows. Are we seeing any impacts out there from, say, community burn bans, or what do the lawns look like, for instance, or in the summertime, can we have the fireworks ceremonies, or all of these different things? Certainly the agricultural impacts in terms of, are we seeing crop stress, which they tend to very early on in terms of that monitoring. So there's a lot of things that we watch for when we talk about drought monitoring.
Now, the drought monitor comes out every Thursday, and we've talked previously about this, that the monitor or the data for that week is actually recorded several days prior. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the process is pretty interesting in terms of the U.S. Drought Monitor. So there is a single author that comes from a couple of the national agencies in the U.S., and they are in charge of developing that map every single week. Now, there are well over 400 volunteers from a lot of state climate offices around the country to other climate centers, to National Weather Service, hydrologists, and others that feed information at the more local scale, the state level scale, into a listserv. It's pretty amazing to watch the emails light up about Monday, and there's just hundreds of emails coming in from all over the country assessing those local conditions. Now, ultimately, that author is the one that has to sign their name on that week's map. The conditions basically go from 12 UTC, or right now it's 8 o'clock in the morning, right, on Tuesday, to the following 8 o'clock in the morning. So all the cutoff date for the data is that Tuesday morning. So for instance, in this case, we still had some lingering rain, obviously, after this past week. We had some heavy rainfall after this week's actual monitor was released, U.S. Drought Monitor was released, which doesn't occur until Thursday. So there is a gap there, right? And sometimes I think that does cause confusion, because we had some heavy rain across northern Miami Valley after the drought, and we still have some areas there that are indicated as abnormally dry on this week's map, and that's why it takes a while. It's a huge undertaking to pull all of that information together. And the drought monitor authors are really, really looking for that local impact information. That's something that really helps them round out where those lines are drawn on that map.
It's having those specialists pretty much living in the area where the monitor is being taken, and then one person being able to collect all of that information to put out the drought monitor.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what we do here in Ohio. So I sort of coordinate the email or the listserv here locally, but it's a lot of National Weather Service in Wilmington, Cleveland, Northern Indiana. We have ODA, ODNR, the State Climate Office. There's a lot of members that kind of pull in at the local region, and that really helps out those authors.
So why is the drought conditions so dangerous in the fall season? We talk a lot about drought in the spring and summer, as you mentioned, with the growing season, and then of course, perhaps fires getting going in the summer. But what is it specifically about the fall that can be dangerous?
Yeah, so when we get to the fall, I mean, traditionally October is a drier month, especially when we start kicking up those winds. When you have high winds and low humidity, like we did a couple of days last week, the fire danger here, which we don't often talk about in Ohio like we do out west, it does become elevated. And so for folks for instance, some of the national forest in Ohio, that fire danger becomes a little bit more elevated. Any burn bans, that might have to go into place to keep you know, fires from getting out of control under such high humidity. And the fact that it, you know, for a lot of certainly Southwest Ohio, since the 1st of September, conditions have been very dry. And so those fuels are very dry this time of the year as well. And so all those things come together, particularly in fall. And of course, drought has different impacts throughout the seasons, as you mentioned, but in the fall, that's what it really comes down to. So for agriculture, for instance, you know, things like combine fires quickly becoming field fires is certainly a possibility and a potential. So there's been an elevated fire risk in the agricultural fields this season, and a number of fires across Ohio because of that as well. So those are a couple of ways that it becomes pretty impactful here in the fall.
So climatologically, are we seeing more extreme and exceptional droughts, not necessarily in Miami Valley, but across the country? I know there's all those wildfires that are burning out west in California and Colorado. Is this becoming more common?
Yeah, so that's interesting, and a lot of us that look at drought has, I mean, for in Ohio and across the Midwest, you think drought, you think 1930s, multi-year droughts. You think some periods in the 1950s, although we had some pretty wet periods in the 1950s as well. But lately, when you think about a lot of the droughts in the Midwest, for instance, and even in some of the numbers will indicate this. Some of the indicators that we look at in drought indices, like standard precipitation index and things, the droughts tend to be a bit shorter, but perhaps they can be really intense. And we go between these very wet periods to intense dry periods and back again a lot quicker. We cycle through those a little bit quicker than we did when we had these longer sustained drought periods. So that's something that I think is an area of research that is blossoming, you know, as we take a look at more ways to define these rapid transitions between wet, extremely wet, where we see these 2, 3, 4, 5 inch rainfalls in just a couple of hours, right into, you know, a tenth of an inch for the next 60 days following that big event. And so I think that's an area of research that's active right now, but certainly the data is suggesting that it's a little bit different. Out west, you know, there's been some recent papers and good studies on you know, this mega drought that really improved up and recently until last year, and now we're slipping back into the long-term drought conditions that we're seeing out west again. So certainly other areas of the country are seeing that a little bit more, because we know that our, you know, overall parts of the desert Southwest, for instance, their precip trends are negative, while overall ours here in the Midwest are going up.
Mm.
It's the timing of the rainfall that's changed just a bit as well.
And speaking of that shift, finally, are we starting to see a shift climatologically in our seasons?
Yeah, so that's always an interesting question, and one that I, as meteorologists, we hear that all the time with the shifts in the seasons. I think what we're overall we have seen an increase in the variability of our seasons, and if it's important to know that each season we're seeing different signs of change. For instance, in the wintertime, it's large, you know, that's when we're seeing the biggest overall change in temperature, uh, daytime highs and overnight lows, versus summertime, where a lot of that's in the overnight lows, for instance, where we're seeing that increase. As far as rainfall, fall is still the strongest trend in the increase in rainfall. The last two falls have been a little bit different than I would say over the last decade. But if you look, I mean, our precipitation in fall is where we see large trends. Since 1980, parts of like north central Ohio are up 35% in their rainfall. Wintertime still getting wet. Springtime, wet trends. And then some of us, July, August around the state have seen negative trends in precip or flat to negative trends. And so what does that mean? That means overall, and what we project is a shift in the precipitation season
Mhm.
to wetter fall, winter, spring, drier summers. And we can think of the last two summers as not what will happen every year, of course, but
Right.
as examples of that type of pattern that we see occurring more often as we move into the future as well.
Well, thank you so much for joining me for this little bit of a chat, and it's very helpful and informative as always. I appreciate talking with you. Is there any final thoughts that you have that pertain to drought and the fall season, and what we may be expecting as we move into the winter months?
Yeah, so that's another, I think interesting thing. I think we're seeing a transition now to a more active pattern. Whether or not that continues into November is yet to be seen, but it certainly looks like this week. In addition to what we saw after last week's U.S. Drought Monitor cutoff, we've got another 1 to 2 inch potential, I think, coming up. So certainly improvements, and soil moisture is recharging, and that's always good to see. You've probably mentioned already on air about the La Nina chances. Of course, that is, with La Nina winter, and likely being a moderate to strong type of La Nina event, it doesn't necessarily change the effects, but we have more confidence that we will have more likely a wetter than average winter, especially as we get into January, February, and March. So I do think that we're about to say goodbye to the drought of 2020, as looking at the forecast, and then we'll be concerned about soggy, wet soils, certainly from an ag perspective, heading into our springtime next year.
Yeah, hopefully it's not like a couple years ago when it was just too wet to plant.
That's right. Yeah, and that's one last thing to remember. Just the how highly variable things are. We remember last year in Northwest Ohio, they could not plant.
Mhm.
Northwest Ohio has been the driest for the longest this entire season. They were really the first to feel the effects of this drought, even late spring. So it's kind of interesting to see the complete difference between those 2 years.
Yeah, it's such a small area and such an extreme difference in just across the state. So
Yeah,
interesting
absolutely.
stuff there. Thank you so much, as always, for joining me. And we'll catch up with you soon, hopefully, as we head into the winter.
Yeah, sounds great, McCall. Thank you.
You're welcome.